Welcome back to House of Hollingsworth. I'm Kate, and today I'm using some salvage materials to build a rolling workbench for my workshop. The plywood and pine 2x4s were left over from a client job, and the farmhouse style table legs were given to me by a friend who was clearing out their own workshop. Now, I hadn't planned on making a fancy workbench. I really just needed extra workspace, but I have a use what you've got mentality, and I love incorporating salvage materials wherever I can, so that's how I ended up making a vintage farmhouse style workbench for free. I made the dimensions up according to the amount of timber and plywood I had. So here I'm cutting off the end of the board to get a perfect 90-degree angle, and then I'm cutting each board to the lengths I want to use for the table's apron. Now I'm cutting some squares of wood to become stretcher blocks. So these will be added to the bottom of the legs to support the stretchers, as well as something to screw the casters onto. I'm joining the workbench together with pocket holes. I'm sure I'm going to receive a bit of flack for this because I should probably be using stronger joinery techniques such as like half laps or mortise and tenons, but I really just wanted to get this built in my spare time over the weekend, and I didn't want to invest extra time on more detailed joinery. I promise I will let you know if the workbench ever falls apart, but for now I'm pretty happy with glue and pocket holes. In a moment, you're going to see a mistake I made. I'd forgotten that I can't use pocket holes in tight spaces because there's not enough room to fit my driver in. So here I am doing a dry fit and realizing that there's not enough room to tighten the screws. So then I pivoted. I attached the longer sides together first, and once I'd done that, I also added some brackets that I had lying around. So between the glue, the pocket hole screws, and the brackets, she's not the prettiest workbench, but she's sturdy. Now I'm attaching the small apron pieces at the bottom, and what you can't see is that I drilled another set of pocket holes on the outside of these short aprons. And yes, I need a longer bit because my short bit keeps falling out of the extender. We're working with what we've got here. This is the very technical method of how to create an inset apron. Use a piece of scrap as a spacer and bop it into place. Also, you can see those extra pocket holes I drilled on the face of the apron. By attaching through the exterior part of the apron, the legs are no longer in the way of my driver. I decided to add a centre support through the middle of the aprons, and of course I cut it a smidge too big. So I went back and shaved a fraction off, and then it was possibly a smidge too short, but I used it anyway and hoped for the best by attaching it with really long screws. Next up, I'm using a sanding block to create a chamfered edge along each side of the stringer blocks. You could totally use a router or an electric sander for this, but since I was just doing 4 pieces, it really didn't take that long by hand. I always save old wooden broom handles because they're basically a long dowel made of hardwood such as oak, and they can be used for so many different things. And here I'm using the broom handle as a stringer along 3 sides. I left the 4th side open so I can easily slide my shop vac underneath the workbench. I used a spade bit to drill these big holes for the dowel. It's not as precise as a drill press, but it'll do just fine. And I glued all the pieces together and then I screwed them down into the legs. I've had these old industrial casters that I salvaged many years ago, and I used WD-40 to clean them up nicely and to lubricate the swivel and locking mechanisms. One of the main reasons I added the stringer blocks to the bottom of the workbench legs is because the plate that attaches the casters is too big to attach to the legs. But by adding a larger block at the bottom, we now have plenty of room to attach the casters. Here it is so far, and already it's looking so cute. I had wanted a thicker apron, but I didn't have wide enough boards, so that's why I used like a doubled up, a couple of 2x4s instead. And I think that was the happiest accident because now it looks like I deliberately routed a beaded groove into the apron. The top isn't actually attached here, it's just resting there. I'm using leftover plywood as the bench top. I really wanted a thicker top, so I'm sandwiching pieces together. The top layer that will be visible is one sheet, but the bottom layer is 3 smaller bits because that's just what I had left. And then I screwed the top on without glue so that if I ever want to swap the top out, it'll be easy to remove from the actual bench itself. Now I'm filling the pocket holes with wood filler. I only filled the ones on the outside. I didn't bother filling the ones underneath the workbench because they won't be seen. I gave the top a quick sand and rounded over the edges a little so they're smoother to hold. Here's the workbench all built. Now, obviously it's just a workbench. It doesn't need to look perfect. But of course I'm going to stain and seal it because I like beautiful things. I'm using a homemade toner just on the plywood top because plywood often looks patchy when you stain it and the toner will even out the colour a bit better. I used Jarrah and full disclosure, the legs had been previously sealed and I completely ignored the directions on the stain and I didn't bother sanding back the legs to raw wood. I just brushed the stain over the old sealant and left it a longer time to dry. Worked like a charm. Once I finished staining, I sealed with high gloss because, you guessed it, that's what I had left over. Now let's talk money. I was fortunate enough to have everything I needed for this build on hand because, as I said, it was all left over from other projects. But just for fun, I added up the cost of all the materials I used and it came in at a whopping $605. The majority of that was the turned legs because a set of these chunky timber farmhouse legs from Hammersmith will set you back $400. I'm really happy with myself for cobbling together a free workbench out of salvage materials. I've saved myself a bunch of cash by using what I've already got, and I've also saved some timber from ending up in landfill. The finished product looks like the antique Jarrah workbench of my dreams. I am absolutely smitten, but more importantly, I now have a workbench that I can easily move around. And because it's not permanently up against a wall, I can use my sliding miter saw on it. I usually use my big miter saw on the ground because I don't have enough big bench space to accommodate such a deep saw. But you can see that now I can pull the workbench away from the wall, so the sliding part of the saw has room to poke out the back. I hope you enjoyed my scrapwood workbench build today. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you next time.